Good evening, Lou Hamilton again of Audible Elegance in Cincinnati, Ohio. And we're going to continue with a series of videos on turntables. And I also write a blog which is easily accessed on our website, which is audibleelegance.com. And there are a number of things that I write about, but some people don't like to read. Unfortunately, I love to write. And so tonight, the first 5 elements of the presentation is going to be about something that you can read on my blog. And then I'm going to go into the other 5 top mistakes I see done on turntables. So let's start with the blog. And the biggest mistake I typically see with turntables that are brought to us for service is that the cartridge itself is not even in its right position. Each cartridge has its measurements and where the stylus sits, and there's different tone arm lengths. But there is a very specific point that stylus must sit down to effectively track the album through an arc where it doesn't create any distortion either on the outer band or the inner band. And one of my earlier YouTube videos, which you can enjoy about inspecting turntables, shows you what happens when a cartridge is either misplaced or that if it's a aftermarket turntable where somebody has mounted an arm, that they actually put the arm in the wrong location. And so everything just disintegrates. The next one that I typically see is that the tone arm itself has already been destroyed. And I'm going to do in a little bit a drawing of what happens mechanically. But a lot of people attempt to mount cartridges themselves. If you have a removable head shell, well, you can avoid many of these problems that occur. But the better turntables have a fixed head shell for rigidity and control of the cartridge itself. And so in the process of trying to mount a cartridge, what they end up doing is applying so much force that they actually damage the bearings in the gimbal assembly. That's the back place where the arm pillar comes up and it rotates horizontally and vertically to control where the arm is moving. And they actually wind up damaging the bearings. And in some cases, the tone arm is shot. It's pointless, don't even try. Where people have done this on Linn tone arms, Linn themselves won't even attempt to get into that assembly. The arm has to be sent back to the manufacturer who has the proper tools to disassemble the arm and to reassemble it with bearings that are not screwed up. And so I'll do a drawing on that so you people understand the mechanics of what's happening. The other one that is common, and I see this all the time, is that the cartridge that they've purchased is not of proper weight for the tone arm itself, or that the counterweight that they have, which is used to apply the proper tracking force, is too light. And regardless of where they position that weight, the arm still wants to raise up. So what people do is they'll add some sort of weight. The standard laugh was always, I couldn't get my cartridge to track right, so I just taped a quarter or a coin on the head shell. But I've seen audiophiles use all sorts of goo, silicone, more tight, you name it, to dampen the head shell, for example. And this creates an own set of problems in that the additional weight changes the inertia motion potentially of what's going on. And I've seen cases where this will actually result in the collapse of the suspension itself. And you have to think about teeter-totters and fulcrums and all of that sort of stuff and inertia. And again, that's a very, very common mistake. The next one I see that is very common is where people read a very flattering review of a cartridge and its performance. And so rather than understanding the geometry, the compliance factors, all sorts of things, they come in and insist upon buying that cartridge for their turntable. And the only way of describing it is like picking up a racing magazine and reading about the performance of some incredible tire for racing, and then you decide to put those tires on your Chevette. It doesn't apply. It doesn't work. And so we've seen a lot of mismatching going on between what a customer wants to buy based upon a review versus what can actually be accomplished effectively with the design of the cartridge and the design of the tone arm. Sometimes you may have to add shims to get things right underneath the tone arm. There's all sorts of things you may need to do, but to just believe that a review of a phono cartridge establishes what you need to have on yours, it's a real mistake. And we see it more often than we like to. The result is usually either poor sonic performance or, again, the introduction of a mechanical problem to the cartridge itself. We just had a turntable today. Customer come in and basically complain about noise coming from his cartridge. And the fact of the matter is that the damage has already been done, and there's nothing that can be done about the situation other than to replace the cartridge, which he didn't want to do because it's going to cost a lot of money. There's nothing I could do. It's already done. So that was number 4 on the top 10 turntable mistakes. The other one of the top 5 that I wrote about on the blog, and again, look at my blogs because there's a lot of information there in detail, is a lot of people make the mistake, and this is very common lore, that the most important thing about a turntable is the phono cartridge. And the truth of the matter is that is about as untrue as one can imagine. The most important thing about a turntable is the thing that spins the record. Think of that as the earth. Next is the tone arm. Think about that as a tripod. And the quality of the cartridge can be anywhere from a cheap, 5 megapixel digital camera to a Leica. And the problem is that if the earth is shaking in an earthquake and you're using a broken tripod, both the cheap digital camera and the Leica are going to give you this wonderful smeared image. And I don't care how much you try. And the point being is that if the cartridge is not given the best opportunity to do what it can, then the money spent on it is essentially money gone, but there's very little benefit to it. I used to take a $50 cartridge, mount it on the best turntable I had and the best tone arm, and compare it to another table that was the exact same turntable but a lesser tone arm, and a cartridge that sold for $2,000 in the 90s. And every demonstration, the customer said, I want that turntable. And then I would tell them which one they picked. And it was the one with the $50 cartridge. And because I was allowing that $50 cartridge to perform at its peak, whereas the very expensive cartridge was limited in this case by the tone arm. And the same thing holds true for the thing that spins the record. So what happens is most people way overspend for a phono cartridge. And the really sad part of that is that is the one element that is consumed and used up. The turntable is still there, the Tonearm is still there, but you're going to have to buy another cartridge at some point. And in reality, most cartridges are good for about 400 hours of play to be within spec. If it's a really good cartridge, really properly mounted, 600 hours, maybe a little more. Now, will they play past those hours? Well, of course they will. But are they performing at their best? They're basically not, which is why even in NASCAR, after a whole bunch of laps, they come in and they get fresh tires, because, yeah, the tires are still working, nothing's flat, but they're not at peak performance. And that's what we're talking about. So if you want to use a cartridge well past its life, well, the only thing you run risking is damage to your records, because you can look up on the web pictures of various styli, essentially gouging the vinyl, and that's permanent. So let's go over and do a couple drawings and get into the other top 5. So I'm going to go back and discuss the damaging of the bearings. And so this is the top of the Tonearm. We have an arm tube that comes out, and it may have an angle to the head shell or whatever, but let's just say this one has, an angle to it. And what happens is, depending upon how much torque and pressure that is involved, that if you have a wrench trying to hold the nut here while using an Allen wrench from the bottom side, so we have this wanting to go this way, tightening is going this way, and what happens is the unresolved pressure goes right back at the bearings, and that's where the bearing damage occurs. And the best thing to do, if you can, in mounting a cartridge is simply remove the Tonearm so that any of your work down here doesn't result in any trauma going back to the bearings. Lynn is very, very specific about this. Other people are less so. I don't know whether that's because they don't care, which I don't believe, or it's just not a message that's being taught to people to pay attention to this. I've seen a lot of damaged bearings on the Sony turntables because these are very common, including, the all-time favorite, the Technics. Although both of these can have removable head shells, which save you from this issue. It's a bit more work setting them up because they're removable head shells, but you can do it without risk to the bearing, the gimbal assembly. However, one that has a fixed head shell is Thorns, and this problem is not uncommon. In 40 years, I would say I've only had one Thorns turntable in the store where it did not either have gimbal problems or main bearing problems. I did a video on that much earlier in the sessions. And once either the bearing assembly is done or the gimbal assembly is done, buy a really cheap phono cartridge because nothing else is going to matter because everything's all screwed up. So I want you to understand the mechanics of this and why it's wise, if you can, to remove the Tonearm. Cheap tables don't allow you to do this. You can't do it with the Thorns with the way that their Tonearm leads are wired into a panel, so you're rather fixed. Thorns also has removable head shells. That's great. They had an early version where it was just the head shell. Later on, they came along with something known as the TP16, where the joining part was way back towards the gimbal assembly, which to me was a horrendous idea. Going back again to the issue of cantilevering and movement, you're applying a lot more force now on a section that can't control it as well as a head shell. So for those people who like Thorns, I much prefer the older Tonearms for this very reason. So that's the discussion of how you can wreck bearings themselves. Enough said. Hold on, now we'll get into the next 5. Now, the next problem that's very common are complaints about footfall or my turntable vibrating while I'm playing music or just simply trying to walk across the room. This store is built upon a concrete pad, so I can jump up and down and there's no vibration coming from the floor itself. In the other part of my building, in fact, we do have that issue, and we're going to talk about that. But most turntables are designed to deal with vibration, particularly their suspension, in what is presumed to be the human hearing range, which is 20 hertz and above. Many turntables then take it a step further in their design, particularly really good ones, where they can go down to about 7 hertz. However, they'll take a turntable and stick it on a very heavy piece of furniture. Now, this one is actually designed to be isolated. You can see points where we're trying to decouple the mass from the turntable, in this case. And a stand will resonate at a very, very low frequency, well below 7 hertz. The problem is that vibration of the stand will find its way right through the suspension of a turntable and right into the performance, and so it degrades it. We had a customer come in who worked with another dealer and returned 4 turntables. And his problem was that his whole assembly would go into this oscillation. When looking at his application, he had extremely large Bauer & Wilkins speakers, very lovely product, combined with these massive subwoofers sitting, which I don't even know why he bothered with the subwoofers, given what the B&Ws could do, right next to the turntable. And so anytime he tried to play anything, he got this, whoa, this oscillation going, and that can destroy a system real quick. And he was on a very heavy piece of furniture. He's thinking about it. We let him play with a Riga, which did much better, but ultimately succumbed to the same problem, even though we used something like isoacoustic pucks. We eventually located a product that would deal with it, and it is a really technical engineering piece to keep any vibration getting into anything, and the platform sells for about $5,000. So he would end up having to spend more money on a platform keeping vibration getting into his turntable than the turntable itself. My recommendation was ditch the subwoofers and let's see where we are from there, because you've got too much mechanical activity going on. And the best thing to do with mechanical activity is try not to absorb it, but to defeat it, and ideally don't even let it get to the turntable itself. So one of the solutions I'm going to show you. So if you're dealing with footfall, or your only option is to set your turntable on a very heavy object, which I've told you why you shouldn't do that, the next option is to simply buy a turntable wall shelf. This one is made by Target. It's a TT1, and you mount it above your turntable where you want to be, off the heavy furniture. There are locations for spikes, and then you have a board which is much lighter, so if it resonates, it's going to resonate above the range that the suspension's already designed to deal with. So you reduce the amount of problems. You certainly get rid of the footfall problem, because your floor, its flexing typically does not have any effect whatsoever on the wall. The next problem that we run into, people are complaining about some form of hum. The normal belief is that the turntable itself is not properly grounded, and turntables have a ground lead with them. Oftentimes it is separate, So it's that little wire that triggers out, and getting that grounded is really important. And people like Riga actually build the ground into one of the channel leads, so you don't have this separate wire. So that's why in the back of most receivers you see that little terminal so that you can put the turntable ground wire on it. That's the most common of the hums, but there's a couple others. If you have a turntable sitting on a platform, what is beneath it and its transformers can introduce hum because the phono cartridge itself picks up the AC field from the transformer itself. And so it's not a matter that the table is bad, that the cartridge is bad. It's that the way you have your equipment stacked is the issue. Now, you would think what we're talking about here are amplifiers, but in the digital age, we now have a new problem, which is your little streamer, because it kicks out a lot of RF. And that RF, depending upon where it is in the rack, can find its way back into the phono cartridge again. We had a fine example of that at the store. We had the hum, so we had to start figuring out what is doing it, and we isolated it to the streamer. So we just simply put it on a lower shelf, end of hum problems. The next one, and part of this, is that all turntables have cable leads. Let me show you. So here we have a Tonearm lead from a Riga, shielded cables, but if these are not properly dressed so that they stay away from the AC power cords, and your AC power cord itself is not shielded, these can pick up, again, the AC hum fields from the power cable, and there's your 60 cycle hum again. So hum is another one that we encounter. Very rarely is it within the turntable itself. There are a few turntables that I won't even look at because they're notorious for having electrical problems internally with hum. So tables like Dual, I don't even want to see them because they're so complex in mechanical junctions that they're notorious for doing hum, either in their head shell or underneath where they have jumper assemblies to mute it when you're not playing a record or the arm's moving from the automatic function. They're notorious little devils. So that's hum. The next one is getting calls from people who say they hear a howling in their system. And more oftentimes than not, they're making the mistake of playing a turntable with the dust cover up. And so what happens as the sound radiates out, and you can put your finger in a pan of water and watch the ringlets, those ringlets are going into this, and they're adding vibration to the base of the turntable itself. And this is why if you have a turntable with a removable dust cover, ideally simply take it off to play your music, and when you're done, put it back on. Now, if you have a removable dust cover and you have cause for not taking it off, and sometimes it can be a pain, then play it with the cover down. For those people who do not have removable dust covers, this is your reason for doing this. As I said, I prefer having it off. However, like one of my customers, I do have cats, and they love to watch moving objects and get too curious for my own fear of what they might do. So drop the dust cover. So that is a slight compromise, but it's not much of one. So the howling and the dust cover is the other one you have to watch out for. Number 9 is really more limited to those people who like to try to improve their turntable, or someone else has tried to improve the turntable. And what it comes down to is right here in the back of the cartridge itself. So we're going to do a close-up of this for a second. And what we have are cartridge tags. Now, in the case of Riga, they don't have pins on the other side for you to attach an aftermarket set of cartridge tags. But as I pictured in one of my earliest blogs, which is why I'd like some people to go over there and see the pictures, some of these have deteriorated so bad that the performance of the cable itself is deteriorated, interfering with the performance of the cartridge and what you get to hear. So watch out for that one. It's rare, but it's limited to the aftermarket, higher end tables. But carefully inspect those. And on some turntables, rather than using gold, they actually used silver, which oxidizes. So again, your performance is deteriorating like a silver coin left out for years in the open. It just simply tarnishes. So that's lovely number 9. Now we'll get to the worst of them. And that is someone who tells you that they're going to rewire the tone arm. And they'll go out and get aftermarket cable and put it in there. And a lot of times this could be well-meaning hobbyist, but the real risk if someone's trying to rewire a tone arm goes right back here again to the bearing assembly. Have they had to go in and monkey with that, which means whatever torque used to assemble it is being ignored. That's one of the nightmares. Another one is that assembly a single piece, or do they have to go to a bottom plate and start soldering onto pins so the tone arm lead can plug into it? God knows what type of work they've done there. And in soldering is not used to make the connection. Soldering is used to secure the connection. So if you were to look at really high-spec military grade, or when Mark Levinson was building equipment, on an assembly line that I could visit, a board from them should work before they put it through the flow solder machine, because you're actually making contact to contact, surface to surface. The solder is only used to hold things in place. So if someone's in there monkeying around and changing tone arm leads, Lord help you. I'll give you a bonus now. Bonus 11. See, you're really more imaginative than you thought. One of the other things that's very common are aftermarket tone arm leads. And one of the best ones I can recall is where an Oracle table came into me, and they wanted to change out the tone arm lead that was supplied by the manufacturer and go with this monstrously diameter MIT tone arm lead. And it took me a couple hours putting that on and making sure that the table would actually move properly before we could test the results. And after a few hours of that, and the customer spent $300 or $400 for the cable, he listened to it. And his response was, "What did I get?" And all I could tell him was, "Well, you have a pretty cable to look at, but there's been absolutely no advantage in performance." So be very careful when you're playing with these aftermarket tone arm cable assemblies. If they're the type that can be plugged and do not compromise anything else about the tone arm, if you buy one, make sure you can return it. Some of them really do work. I've encountered a couple of them that are very fine, but specifically with the cartridge that was on the table. And otherwise, it's a real royal crapshoot. I personally do not recommend it because it is such a crapshoot. And I've got better things to do than spend my time testing tone arm leads against whatever cable and whatever tone arm to see if it works or not. And whether reviewers really do it right anyway, good luck. So those are my top 10 with the bonus of the 11 about what I see going wrong with people with turntables. Hopefully this advice will give you some tips how to solve yours or to avoid future problems if you buy a turntable. Okay, I'm really fond of Baker's Dozens, so we're going to do the 12th one, and that is how the cartridge on the turntable is mounted itself. To be honest, I've seen enough turntables come in that I would have been better off using a Phillips head screwdriver and a drywall screw to mount the cartridge, because they've done it all wrong in how they've mounted it. And it's not only the position we're talking about the amount of torque or pressure that is used to couple the cartridge to the head shell area. I did an experiment for my staff here showing them how important it is on Riga turntables to use their device to attach cartridges to the tone arm. This is a slip drive. It allows so much pressure and then it gives away. And so what I did was I loosened it up to show them what happens when a cartridge is slightly loose, and the performance deteriorated dramatically. So then let's go to the other end of the spectrum and apply what's affectionately known as in our industry as Lin tight, which is just short of breaking everything. And when I applied too much torque and really tried to make the cartridge attach to the head shell, the performance deteriorated again. Now, whether that was specifically caused by warping the body itself, or cracking things, because I've seen in older turntables, the Supex cartridges, which were plastic body where the mounts were cracked because of too much pressure put on. I don't know, but I do know that we use tools here to make sure that we're applying the pressure that is generally respected by both, the head shell area and by what the cartridge itself can handle. So I've seen a lot of screw ups there where the cartridge is either flopping around or Lord knows what. And of course, when I talked about it earlier, occasionally I'll drop a cartridge and I'll find a lead weight underneath the head shell and on top of the cartridge, and God knows what that's causing. So that's my 12th for you. That's not uncommon. And no, don't use Phillips head screwdrivers and drywall screws. It was just my pointing out how frustrating it can be when I have a table brought into me with a problem, and it has nothing to do with the table or the cartridge. It has to do with the human factor.